Jesus didn't tell his followers to build buildings or raise money. He told us to make disciples. What if the church is failing at that in America? What if in all our efforts we've lost sight of Jesus? Well, we don't have to rely on our opinions to know how the U.S. church is doing. Dozens of existing studies prove beyond doubt that the church in the United States is declining. Gather all the facts and a clear picture emerges. In the next 20 years, we will witness an implosion and disintegration of the American church. The church is declining because the outside culture is changing faster than even it realizes. And as this storm builds outside, the church is also weakening inside. Our kids are quitting the faith. Our evangelism efforts are failing. Our funds are declining. And around the world, on other continents, the church is growing. But our church, the richest in world history, is shrinking. American Christians now make up just 1/5 of the worldwide body of Christ, and yet we hold 4/5 of our wealth. And somehow, we spend almost all of it on ourselves. Do we really think God gave us 80% of His church's wealth so we could spend it all on ourselves? We've fallen into a dollar-centric, Americanized deformity of the gospel. In our insistence on running Christ Church like a Walmart or a McDonald's, our obsession with dollars and comfort and convenience is costing us. Jesus promised that He would build His church, but He didn't promise to use American methods. The facts about the decline of the American church force us to answer a question. Are we more committed to Christ, to American Christianity as we know it?
Well, I want to welcome you to week 3 of a series we've been in called Meltdown, the Decline of the American Church. Now, as you can see, I'm not delivering this message at the Southwest campus like usual. I'm actually in my home, and I think you'll understand why here as we get into the message. So the video you just saw was a trailer. We didn't put that together. It's actually for a book that was released in 2013 called The Great Evangelical Recession: 6 Factors That Will Crash the American Church and How to Prepare by John Dickerson. Now, I said this last week, and I'm going to say again. We are not a doom and gloom church, okay? The video and all of that can seem like doom and gloom. We're not predicting the end of the world next week. We're not predicting that everything's terrible and falling apart and it's all. We're just disturbed by some trends that this guy, John Dickerson, the author here, is raising. And we're not the only ones. He's not doom and gloom either. There's a lot of other reputable people, seminary presidents, other conservative evangelical leaders that are concerned about these trends like we are. And so we would do well to look at the trends, evaluate how they affect us, and then begin to prepare for whatever the future might hold. So that's what we're doing in this series. If you hadn't been here, let me review the first couple of factors. We're doing 4 of the 6 factors. If you want the rest of them, you're welcome to grab the book. But 4 of the 6 factors kind of through an e-life lens. So factor number 1, if you were here the first weekend, is the evangelical church in the United States is not nearly as large as we've been told. Some of us thought it was 80% of the country is evangelical Christian. It's not 80%. Some people thought it was 40%. It's not 40%. But we learned in week 1, it's between 7 and 8.9% of the population that's evangelical Christian. That's like 20 to 30 million people. So much less than a lot of us would have thought. Factor number 2, unless generational patterns change radically, many ministries will see revenue decrease by 50 to 70% in the next 10 to 30 years. Think about that. 50 to 70% in the next 10 to 30 years. That would be catastrophic for the evangelical church. We talked about that week 2. You can go back and watch those messages if you missed either of them. Here's factor number 3, and I said potentially this is the most disturbing. Factor number 3 that could lead to meltdown that we should think about and prepare for is this. The evangelical church in the United States is losing the people it does have, and the 20-somethings are exiting faster than any other group. So not only are we small, what's disturbing about this is we're declining. We're losing the people we do have, and the 20-somethings, those are the kids of many evangelicals. They're exiting faster from the movement than any other group. I read this story recently, and I wanted to read it to you because chances are you know somebody like this. This is becoming a common story And this is really, really sad. I read this, the story said this. Scott Miller, this guy named Scott, always memorized the Bible verses in his Sunday school class as a kid. He knew the Bible well, Scott did. He had evangelical parents. They loved the Lord, and they had been faithful to each other in their 35-year marriage. They went to church every Sunday as a family and even on Wednesday night. Scott, now 30 years old, doesn't believe in God anymore. The last time he set foot in a church building was for a wedding 2 years ago. He doesn't think the Bible is believable or even relatable to his life anymore. Chances are you know somebody just like Scott. You see, he's one of about 260,000 evangelical young people who walk away from Christianity every year. He's one of roughly 2 in 3 evangelical 20-somethings who abandon the faith by age 30. Pastors have long thought that kids like Scott will return. They'll come back in their 30s, but those who know this demographic best say it's not likely the case. Scott will most likely not return according to formal studies and informal expert experience with young former evangelicals. And perhaps this is the most disturbing trend we face because we're failing to retain even our own children as disciples. Simply keeping our kids as disciples would help us keep up with population growth, but we're not keeping our kids, some of us, many of us, and we're not keeping up with population growth. Research indicates that more than half of those born into evangelicalism are leaving the movement during their 20s, and the majority never return. The number of those leaving has never been higher in the United States, and the number of those returning has never been lower. Researchers, Josh McDowell, Lifeway Research, the Barna Group, other secular researchers, including ones at UCLA, have all landed at figures between 69 and 80% of evangelicals in their 20s who leave the faith. The Lifeway findings were so radical that Tom Rainer told USA Today, and I quote, "The millennial generation, those 18 to 29, will see churches closing as quickly as GM dealerships." That was before the government bailout. This has been shown to be true from the other side, too. When surveying unchurched young adult Americans, Ed Stetzer was surprised to find the majority of them were previously churched, but they'd abandoned church. Stetzer said this, he said, "There's no easy way to say it, but it must be said. Parents and churches are not passing on a robust Christian faith and an accompanying commitment to the church. Christian parents and churches need to ask the hard question, what is it about our faith commitment that does not find root in the lives of our children?" Ouch. Now, some of you say, well, okay, I know they leave. Hey, Chris, I know that, Pastor, I know that. Some people leave, but they'll come back right later, like in their 30s or 40s. They're going to come back. Some do. Some that leave come back. But Lifeway researchers have found 35% of these people do make their way back, but 65% don't come back. So the majority, 65%, don't return. So roughly of every 3 young evangelicals who leave, 2 don't come back. They don't return. Let's give some real numbers to these percentages. Of the 3.7 million U.S. evangelicals who are 18 to 29, 2.6 million will leave the faith at some point between their 18th and 29th birthdays. That's 260,000 who leave each year. That's 712 that'll quit the faith today, 712 are going to quit the faith tomorrow, 712 the next day, and so on. Isn't that crazy? And if this rate of leaving the church continues to the next generation of 18 to 29-year-olds, and evidence indicates that it will, about 5 million people will have left the U.S. church between 2007 and 2027. That's 5 million departed from a church of only 20 to 30 million, like we talked about the first week. It led the author of the book, John Dickerson, to say this. He said, "The bleeding from this wound on the body of Christ is not just the red of a skinned knee. It's not a dripping cut. It's a gushing artery. We are losing almost 10% of our total U.S. evangelical church from the generation that is most strategic to the future of the church." Now, the body of Christ is bleeding out the most among the young, but they're not the only ones leaving, as you know. Princeton professor Kendra Dean suggests that the loss of our youth is not an aberration, but an indication of what's actually going on in the larger church among all generations. I'm sure you're like, why is this happening Two more quotes. Dave Kinnaman's a researcher and author. He says, this is his opinion, the dropout problem is at its core a faith development problem. To use religious language, he said, it's a disciple-making problem. John Dickerson, the author of the book, said this. He said, here's the reason. The body is bleeding out because its leaders, its servants, and its people have forgotten how to make disciples as Jesus described and modeled. To slow the bleeding loss of our young people, we must first reach their parents with authentic relational discipleship. And to reach the parents, we must first reach their leaders and in many cases, their pastors. Their pastors. Well, that's me. Is there a problem with the pastors that says that somebody's forgotten how to make disciples as Jesus described and modeled? Is that true of me? Is that true of pastors? Well, I can't speak for all pastors, but I'll speak for myself. I think I am part of the problem. I think the solution starts with me because I'm part of the problem. I think I've contributed to creating this problem, at least in our church. And as hard as it is for me to admit, right? Like no pastor wants to admit, well, I got a problem. I haven't done things, maybe all the things the way I should have. But honestly, if I'm being totally transparent, I think I'm part of this problem. You're like, Pastor, what do you mean? What did you do? Well, I think the author defines the problem well that I've contributed to. He says, if we want to rebuild and restore a culture of discipleship, we have no choice but to release the way American church was done in the 20th century. The late 20th century church model in so many applications requires so much energy and attention that little to nothing is left for anything else, including discipleship. The 20th century church model, which revolves around buildings, weekend gatherings, sermons and such, is not primarily focused on discipleship. Discipleship gets crowded out because doing all those things takes so much time. We do all those things hoping we get discipleship, but it doesn't seem to be working. And I agree with them, and I think the way I've contributed to this is I've built the kind of church he's talking about, the 20th century model church that can so easily, unintentionally, unfortunately, crowd out discipleship. Because you're consumed with weekends and gatherings and sermons and all, bands, and it can crowd out the very purpose for which you exist, which we know is to make disciples. And I've created this kind of church. So let's go back, like he said, to what Jesus did. What did Jesus do? If we want to make disciples, you want to make disciples, I want to make disciples, our church wants to make disciples. In the American church, I think pastors want to make disciples. When Jesus wanted to make disciples, what did he do? Did he get a building? Hey, we got to get a building. Hey, disciples, come here. We got to get this building, all right? And then I'm going to preach a sermon. You got to give me a fancy microphone. I'm going to give me one of those headsets, all right? I'm going to preach this sermon. I'm going to preach it on Sunday mornings, and we're going to get a good band, with some lights and all that. And that's how Jesus was going to make disciples, right? Kind of like what we do here. You can do all that, right? That's not what he did. Now, Jesus taught crowds, for sure. But for some reason, he selected 12. What did he call them? 12 men. What were they called? 12 disciples. For some reason, he selected 12 disciples and spent a great deal of time investing in them. But why? Why did Jesus select 12 and not just focus on the 12,000? Why select 12 when you can preach to crowds? And he did, of thousands and thousands. Just spend all your time with the crowds. Don't spend your time with 12 people when you can spend your time with thousands of people. Why did he focus on the 12? Maybe it's because with true discipleship, it requires spending time with people. And you can't spend time with 12,000 people. But maybe you can spend time and do life with 12. And when you think about discipleship and what he did with those guys, discipleship implies you're spending time together, doing things together. You're being mentored by the person that's discipling you. They're giving you feedback. They're modeling, and then you're doing what they did. And then they're, talking to you about how you did. I mean, discipleship involves a relationship, apprenticing someone where there's this kind of feedback. It requires time. You're trying to do what they do. You're following them or wherever they go and do what they do and say what they say. You can't do that with 12,000 people. Jesus put all his eggs for the future of the church in the basket of 12 men. And as you know, it was a good strategy. It turned the world upside down. He focused, though, on 12, a smaller group. What about the early church? How did they make disciples? Well, they met in these smaller disciple-making communities with the purpose of going out and making disciples and planting churches. And guess what? Guess what they called them? These small disciple-making communities. Guess what they called them? Yeah. Yes. Small groups. No, that's not it. Yes. They called them community groups. I bet they called them community groups. That's not what they called them. Yes, you. I bet they called them LTGs. That's the Eli. That's probably in the Bible, right? That's LTGs is what they call them. They didn't call them LTGs. Do you know what they called the early church? These small disciple-making communities where they met for the purpose of disciple-making and church planting. You know what they call them? Let me show you. It might surprise you. Romans 16, verse 5, Paul said this, "Also give my greetings to the church that meets in their home." They met in these small disciple-making communities in their home, and they called them churches. You say, now wait a second, Chris, here's the thing, Pastor, here's the thing. You can't have a church in a home, all right? Because I know how church works. What you got to do is you show up to this building, they got this service, you got a band, then you got some announcements, okay? Then you got to have a preacher come up. That's what you do for church. How do you even do that in a home? You're thinking about the American church, what we do. That's not exactly what they did. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 19. "The churches here in the province of Asia," Paul said, "send greetings in the Lord, as do Aquila and Priscilla and all the others." Watch this, you're not going to believe this. "All the others who gather in their home for" what? LTGs. No. "Who gather in their home for church meetings." Yeah, Chris, here's the thing. I already told you, bro. You can't have a church meeting in a home. Like, you got to have a paid pastor. And how could you have a paid pastor in every home? That's just not what they did. They met in homes. They didn't necessarily have a paid pastor in every home. You don't have to have that. Colossians 4, verse 15. "Please give my greetings to our brothers and sisters at Laodicea and to Nympha and the church that meets in her" what? I'll let you guess. The church that meets in her what? Her house. You're like, Chris, here's the thing. Here's the thing you're not even understanding. You got to have the Eli band, bro. You got to have the Eli band with the lights and the smoke. I like that smoke. I always think the building's on fire. It's amazing. You got to have that, or you can't even have a church. I love the Eli band. Eli band's awesome. They didn't have the Eli band. All right. Philemon 1 and 2. "I'm writing to Philemon," Paul says, "our beloved co-worker, and to our sister Apphia, and to our fellow soldier Archippus, and to the church that meets in your" what? The church that meets in your house. They met because they wanted to make disciples like we do. They met in small disciple-making communities, and they called them churches. When they thought of church, they thought of this thing that meets in a home, that meets for the purpose of disciple-making and church planting. When we think of church, what do we think of? Weekend gathering and a speaker and a band and all that. It's just not maybe what they thought of when they thought of church. And what about in these movements of God around the world we've been talking about? You know, I've been talking about the gospel is just exploding in parts of the world. Lots of people coming to know Jesus by the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions. When they want to make disciples around the world in India, parts of Africa, China, what are they doing? Well, I'll give you a couple stories. You say, hey, Chris, they're doing it like Eli. Surely somebody's doing it like Eli, the American church. They're having these weekend gatherings, they're building. I don't want to disappoint you, but that's not what they're doing either. Here's some stories about what's happened in some of these moves of God around the world. In Southeast Asia, okay, it's not America, right? In Southeast Asia, a missionary strategist began working with 3 small house churches in 1993. Just watch this. Just 7 years later, membership had swollen to more than 90,000 baptized believers worshiping in 920 new house churches. What? Here's what I know for sure. If you start out with 3 Elifes, okay, they had 3 small house churches, you don't get 920 more of them in 7 years. I mean, they're meeting in a small disciple-making community that's easy to reproduce. What we do here, it's great. I love what we do at Eli. It's hard to reproduce Elifes all over the place, right? Requires lots of money, lots of paid staff, trained staff, all that. It's harder. Because they were just letting ordinary people lead and plant churches, they were able to reproduce quickly and went from 3 churches in 93 to 7 years later, 920 new churches. They made disciples by reproducing these disciple-making communities. They called them churches also. Another story. During the decade of the 1990s, Christians in a Latin American country overcame relentless government persecution to grow from, watch, 235 churches to more than 4,000 churches, with more than 30,000 converts awaiting baptism. How do you go in a short period of time from 235 churches to 4,000 churches? It's got to be smaller. It's got to be easy to reproduce. It's got to be similar to what the early church did or what Jesus did with his 12. One more story from these movements of God. A missionary strategist assigned to a North Indian people group found just 28 churches among them in 1989. 28 churches. These were house churches. By the year 2000, 11 years later, a church planning movement had erupted, catapulting the number of house churches from just 28 to more than 4,500, with an estimated 300,000 baptized believers. What? So around the world, where they're making disciples like crazy, what are they doing? They're focusing on these small disciple-making communities. They call them churches, and they're reproducing them so quickly, so rapidly, and it's reaching hundreds of thousands of people. It's amazing. But in order to make disciples, they're thinking more about small groups of people that can multiply. So I think that's where our problem begins in the American church, just my opinion. It has something to do with size. So Jesus, the early church, and these movements of God around the world, for discipleship, they're relying on small gatherings of disciples to multiply, to go out and make disciples and plant new churches. They're doing discipleship in these small gatherings. In the American church, what are we doing? We're trying to disciple huge groups of people. I'm not just talking about big churches like Eli. Even a church of 500, they're trying to disciple 500 people on a weekend, or 300 people on a weekend, or like an Eli, thousands of people on a weekend, and we wonder why it isn't working. It's hard to spend time with hundreds or thousands of people. It's difficult. They stayed small for the sake of being able to multiply quickly, and we're trying to go huge and disciple everybody all together in one room. And even Jesus didn't try to do that. He taught crowds for sure, but his discipleship interests were primarily with these 12. Now, before you stone me, I love weekend gatherings. I'm not saying anything wrong with weekend gatherings. We're going to keep doing weekends, and I think they serve a purpose. I'm just saying we don't want to rely on them in our church or the American church anymore for the purposes of disciple making and church planning and doing that rapidly. Jesus didn't rely on weekends for that. The early church didn't rely on weekends for that. And movements of God around the world, they're not relying on weekends for that. They're relying on these small disciple-making communities that can multiply rapidly. And I think that that's what we have to do as a church, to bring discipleship back and make it a priority. So I think we need to have a flip. I think a flip is going to have to happen in our church, a flip in priority. I think we need to elevate the priority of these small disciple-making communities. Elevate their priority. Make them the top thing, the most important thing. And then have these weekends, which are great, serve the purposes of this discipleship engine, which are your disciple-making communities. We got to flip the priorities, because by flipping the priorities, what we do is we put discipleship, which we know happens best in these small communities, at number one, and then the weekend, again, serves the purposes of discipleship. Now, what that's going to require us doing is also flipping time and energy and resources. Continuing to have a great weekend, but not putting 100%, like the author said, is part of the problem, 100% of our time, energy, resources in the weekend, and forsaking these things that really can make disciples, these small communities. So we've got to pull back some from the weekend and time, energy, resources, and put them into these disciple-making communities if we want to bring back discipleship to priority in our church. And I think if American churches want to bring it back to a place of priority in their church. So really I have two challenges for you, and then we'll be done. One challenge is for me, and one challenge is for you. The challenge for me is this. I need to lead our staff to put a new level of energy, time, and attention into building these disciple-making communities. I've got to redirect some of our energy away from what we put all our energy into, which hasn't made, to the degree we hope, disciple-making disciples. And we need to redirect it some to this engine that we know around the world and with Jesus in the early church can do that, can make disciples that make more disciples down to fourth and fifth and sixth generations. I've got to redirect some of our energy. I'm going to do that in 2017. Take some of our energy and time and resources and put it into these communities so we elevate discipleship as a church. So hopefully we keep some of these people we're losing, so we don't continue to bleed out as a church, our church in the American church. And then here's the thing I need you to do. That's what I'm going to do. Here's what I need you to do. I need you to start viewing these groups that we have, we call them LTGs, as the priority of your church experience each week. I've said for years, you don't get the full church experience eLife has to offer just by coming on the weekends. At eLife, you can't just come on the weekends and check off the church box. Hey, mom, hey, dad, I went to church. Check it off. I was on the weekend. There's things that we do in small groups that are purposes of the church that you don't get on the weekends. We've always said, if you come to church at eLife is like the weekend and the smaller groups put together. You need to do both. And so I'm encouraging you this year as you think about your church experience. Don't just think weekends up here, if I can make it to a small group, that's great. No, reframe it. Reverse it in your mind. I got to get in a group. I got to get in a small community of disciples, and then I'll also go to a weekend, but I'm not going to keep neglecting the small community and just go to the weekend and think I can check the church box. You can't. Not at eLife. Not anymore. For us, the church experiences both of these together. So would you make attending one of these disciple-making communities in 2017 a priority? So much so that if you're sick and you can only either go to the group or to the weekend on a given week, choose the group. Skip the weekend and choose the group, because it's these groups, these small communities that I believe can really make a difference in discipleship in the American church, multiply quickly, and reach a lot of people in our country and around the world. And here's what's great about you prioritizing these groups. Here's what's great. It's going to give you what I think you've always wanted. Number one, a closer walk with Jesus. I experience that more so in a group than anything else. You will too. You want a closer walk with Jesus? You want to be more like Jesus? You got to be in a group. That's number one. Two, friends to walk through life with. Don't you want godly friends? It's hard to make friends in a gathering. Look around. I mean, there's thousands of people here. It's hard to make friends in just a gathering like this. These smaller communities give you the opportunity to build lifelong friendships where you walk with God together throughout your life. And three, something we all desire, they give you the opportunity to be a part of changing the world. You want your life to count, right? For something huge. You want to make a difference in the world, right? These disciple-making communities are the best opportunity for you to do that, no doubt about it. So much so that, like I talked about last weekend, long-term, you could be a part in a small disciple-making community of making hundreds, maybe thousands of disciples, starting a couple of churches, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of churches that can multiply quickly because you're focused on this small community of disciples. You could change the world. That's another reason you should get involved. So again, the trends aren't good. We're losing people, our own children. We're losing people. We don't want to keep losing people. It is a discipleship problem, and it starts with me. I've helped to create that problem, and I apologize. I ask for your forgiveness. But right here and now, hear me saying, I'm going to reprioritize the engine that I know is best at making disciples, and that's these small disciple-making communities. As a staff, as your pastor, we're going to reprioritize. Put that up top. And hopefully by doing so, these things are going to multiply like crazy. And we're not only going to reach our city, we're going to reach our region, we're going to reach our nation, we're going to be a part of changing the world. I believe it can happen. I believe our best days are ahead of us. Even though these trends are bleak, the future of our church, the future of the church, I believe is very bright. It's very bright. Factor number 4 is next weekend. You don't want to miss it. We'll conclude next weekend with factor number 4, and I hope you'll come back and bring some friends. Let me pray as we close. God, thank you so much for just bringing these trends to our minds, to our awareness, so that we can do something about it. God, it saddens me. Stories like Scott, like I shared at the beginning, people that started off as a part of the movement following Jesus and say, forget it all. God, we don't want to see that happen to our kids. We don't want to see that happen to our friends. So God, help us to recover disciple-making like Jesus did it and the early church did it, and people are doing it in moves of God around the world. God, help us to recover that so that these people stay a part of our movement and so that we reach new people. God, we don't want to just reach thousands. Thank you for the thousands, God, that have committed their lives to Christ at eLife, but we want to be a part of a move of God that reaches tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands, millions, like we're seeing in other moves of God around the world. God, we pray that you would do something awesome in our church, do something awesome in our lives. I pray that everybody here today, if they're not involved in a disciple-making community, would get involved in one. They would get trained, and they would make many disciples the rest of their lives, and they would plant many churches in the rest of their life as well. God, you got a big plan for all of our lives, and it's bigger than just sitting in a service, checking off a box on Sunday morning. You want us to make disciples, that plant churches, that plant more churches, and we can't wait to be a part of it. Thanks, Jesus. In your name, amen. Thanks for checking out one of our messages today. For more information about our church or to watch other messages, you can go to our website at experiencelife.now.com. Let us know if we can serve you in any way, and we hope to see you real soon.